Okay, so now that we created a new project in Java in REPL, let's take a look at the system.out.println method. So as we mentioned at the end of the previous video, this function will simply print out whatever message is found between these two parentheses and these two quotation marks. So running this prints out the message, a different message. So again, we can take the content of this string and change it to whatever I want. So I can say maybe 1, and then I can copy this function again, paste it under that, and change this to 2. Do that again down here, type out 3, and run it. And what I should see output on my console is messages 1, 2, and 3. And there we go. There we have it. So this is just a print message function. And so all it does is, again, just takes whatever string we have inside of the parentheses and it prints it out onto the console. So now let's take a look at string. Well, first of all, let's take a look at data types in Java. So a data type in Java is just a container for a specific type of data. And just before moving forward, these two forward slashes indicate a comment. So a comment in any kind of programming language simply allows a programmer to write a message to kind of explain what is going on in the code. For example, this is a message that will not be read by Java. So this here on line 4, it's not a piece of code. So this is not a line of logic. It's not a line of Java code. It's simply a message that I wrote for myself to kind of give me some sort of reminder or an explanation as to what's going on in my code. So I can say below are 3 print statements. And if I run this, comments won't have any effect on the logic or the way that the program runs. So they'll be completely ignored by Java. The only thing that won't be ignored is your actual code. And actually, I can comment out actual lines of code in case maybe I'm troubleshooting something and I don't want to have this line of code execute. I can just comment that out, run it again. And like I said, anything any line that's um, prefixed by these two forward slashes will be ignored by Java. So as you can see, 1 does not get printed out anymore because we put it in a comment. If I delete that, then 1 will come back. So we will have 1, 2, and 3 output on my console. All right, so back to data types. So Java has a series of data types. For example, string, int, and a double. And we'll cover these 3 in detail, but for now we're going to focus on string. And just to kind of give you a preview and an idea of what data types are used for. So ints are used to store integer values, like numbers. Doubles are used to store numbers also, but more specifically numbers that contain decimal values. So numbers like 2.5, 2.71, 3.841, those kinds of numbers. So we're going to focus on the string data type in this video. So strings are, in essence, just messages. They are a series of alphabetic characters. So it can be like, this is a string, or maybe a name like John, or John and Doe, or just a random bunch of numbers, letters, and special characters. A string can contain anything. So just to give you an example of declaring a string attribute, the very first thing you need to do when you're declaring a new data type is specify the type of data you're going to be holding. So again, I mentioned we have different data types in Java. So we have strings, we have ints, we have double. Okay, so in this case, we're focusing on the string data type. So we're going to specify string as our data type. And then you need to give your variable a name. So in Java, you can name your variables anything. They can be literally anything you want, so long as they don't start with a number or a special character like this, you should be fine. Okay, so no special characters and no numbers as the first character of your variable name. So it always has to be a letter. Okay, so I'm gonna name my string variable just my string variable. Okay, and I'm gonna assign it a value. And what I mean by this is I'm gonna store a value, a string value, kind of like 1 or 2 or 3. And I'm gonna store that value into this variable that contains this name, my variable, my string variable. So to do that, I'm gonna use the equal sign. So this is kind of like in math when you have like x equals 80 or something, so like if you see this letter X, you know that it's not actually the letter X. You're actually going to be using the 80 in place of it. So for example, let's say you have a function called maybe f of x, and it's equal to x plus 2, right? And if you have x equals 80, then what you actually have is f of 80, which is equal to 80 plus 2, because again, x is equal to 80, which we assigned over here. So 80 plus 2, or x plus 2, is equal to 82. Now, the logic is essentially the same, except you're not, in this case, with a string variable, you're not storing a number in x. We're storing a string. It can be something like my name, for example. And we'll take a look at an example here. So let's say my string variable contains John Doe, okay? And then we finish that up with a semicolon. So what we're doing here in line 5 is we're declaring a new variable. And whenever you declare a variable, there are 3 components to it. So the first component is specifying the data type. And in this case, our data type is a string because we're going to store a string of characters in this variable. Okay, so that's the first component. The second component to declaring a variable is naming your variable. In my case, I just named it my string variable. And then the third component is assigning it a value and specifying it. So in this case, I'm assigning the value John Doe to the variable my string variable. Okay, so now in a previous video, we hard-coded 1, 2, and 3 into our print statements. But what if I wanted to print John Doe 3 times? Well, if I wanted to hard code this, I would need to print out or type in John Doe 3 times, right? So John Doe there, John Doe here, and John Doe a third time there. I'm going to comment this out for now. I'm going to run this. And what this will do is it'll print out John Doe 3 times. And that's the functionality I want, except I had to type out John Doe 3 times in a row. And that's tiresome. It's repetitive and it's error prone, because what if instead of typing out John Doe, I want to type out Jane Doe. Well, in that case, I'd need to also change this from John Doe to Jane Doe. And the same thing here. And you can see how tedious, how annoying, and how time consuming that can be. So just wait until that finishes running and then we'll move on. Okay, great. So we got Jane Doe 3 times. So an easier way to do this, an easier way of printing out a value multiple times is by storing the value or the string that we want to have repeated in a variable. And actually, I'm going to rename this to maybe name. Give it a more descriptive name. So just to reiterate, we have declared here a variable of type string. We gave it the name because it contains someone's name, right? And we assigned it the value Jane Doe. Now, here, what I'm doing is I'm hard coding. This is called hard coding, when you take double quotes and you just randomly put it into this print statement here. You're hard coding the name Jane Doe 3 times, and that's tedious, that's annoying. And so a good way of not having to repeat yourself like this is by using, instead of hard coding the string Jane Doe in your print statement, you can simply just put in the name of your variable that contains the content that you want to print out. In this case, the name of my variable is just name. But again, the name of your variable can be anything. Okay, so I just named it name because the content of this variable is someone's name. So instead of constantly having to go in and print out or type in Jane Doe like this, all I need to do is simply specify the name of the variable that contains the string that I want to print out. And if I run this, it'll print out Jane Doe 3 times. And there we are. So how does this simplify my life? Well, if I want to change the value of name, if I want to change the name that gets printed out here in the console 3 times, I don't need to go into each one of these print statements one by one and change it like I used to. All I need to do is change the value here. Save that and run it again. And my output has changed. So now, because the name value is now no longer Jane Doe, it is John Doe. Okay, so that's one reason why we use variables instead of hard coding things all over the place. Now, another cool thing you can do with strings is you can have 2 separate strings. Maybe I'll change this to just contain John. I'll call this first name. And I'll create a second string variable and I'll call it last name. Actually, let's make this, yeah, that's fine. So now what I did was I have 2 separate variables now. I have one variable containing my first name and another variable containing a last name. So now I want to print these out. So I just copy and paste the variables that I want to print out and run that. So what this should do is print out the first name followed by the last name. The first name being John, the last name being Doe here. So what you can do with strings is something very similar to what you might do in math class, right? So you have maybe the number 4 and you want to add on the number 6, right? That yields 10, right? Maybe you want to add 1 plus 1, and that equals 2, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, you can also use the plus sign to add strings together. And the way that works is as follows. So what I can do is, instead of having these two print statements, I can just have one single print statement, specify what I want to print out. And in this case, I want to print out my first name and my last name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first name and I'm going to add onto it my last name, or my last name variable. Okay, and I'm going to run this and I'm going to look at what happens to this. What's the output that results from this? All right, so my output is just the value of my first name added on to the value of my last name. And you'll notice that they're not spaced out. They're just bunched in together, and that's by design. So in Java, if you want to add spaces to things, you need to specify it explicitly. So remember how in the past, or in an earlier example, we looked at how we hard-coded things like Jane Doe or John Doe. I'm just going to hard code a space character. So this is all I'm doing, just a single space. And I'm going to rerun this. So what this is going to do is going to take the value of my first name. It's going to add on to that a single space character. And then onto that, it'll add on the value of my last name. So what we end up with is John, which is my first name, space, which is a space character I added here, and Doe, which is the value of my last name. Okay, so you can do this addition of strings, or the technical term is called string concatenation. You can do that in the print statement, or what you could do to make your code a little cleaner is define a new string variable and maybe call it something like full name, and set that equal to the value of your first name plus a single space character plus the value of your last name. And of course, always remember that you need to end your lines of code with a semicolon. The same way that you might end the same way you might end a sentence in the English language with a period, in Java you end it with, or you end the line of code with a semicolon. Okay, it just tells your Java compiler that you are done writing this line of code and it can move on to the next one. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, on line 7, we are creating a brand new variable. We're calling it full name, and we are giving it the value, or we are storing the value of first name plus a space character plus our last name. And these are two other variables that have been defined up here. Okay, so now here what I can do is get rid of this and just use my new variable containing the concatenated value of my first name along with a space character and the value of my last name variable. I can run that, and my value should be, or the output should be, John, which is my first name, space, which is a space I added here, and Doe, which is the value of my last name. So again, you can get pretty creative with assigning values to strings and concatenating them and creating brand new variables. Or you can go the long way and just take these values and hard code them, or just concatenate them on the fly like this. It makes no difference really, but it does add, if you do concatenate your values and store those concatenated values inside of new variables, that does clean up your code a little bit, and it makes it a lot easier to read. So one last thing before we end this video. So you can actually store a number as a string variable. So for example, I can store the number 23 or the number 23,000 or any number really in this string variable. Doesn't matter. But just keep into account that you won't be able to add anything onto this variable. So mathematically, you won't be able to add, let's say, 2 and 2, right? So these are going to be treated as text values. So just keep that in mind. But you can store numbers in here. And in the next video, we'll take a look at how you can actually store numbers as numbers instead of as text, and derive some pretty cool mathematical results from them. So just keep this in mind, and we'll cover this in the next video. There's your output. All right.